artificial intelligence development plan of China. We have Mr. Ravish Bhatia, who is currently a Yenching scholar at the Peking University. He is also a visiting fellow at the George Mason University. He has been working on the technology policy and the industrial economics for some time now. I think we'll have his presentation and we can come into the issues. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pedro. I hope I'll try to be as loud as I can, but at the onset I'm very happy to get the chance to present an ICS. I remember not long ago I was sitting somewhere there frantically taking notes on some of the other Wednesday seminars, so I feel very honored and very grateful. So I think the whole world has shifted so much now with the discussions of another industrial revolution, especially with the onset of a general purpose technology. By definition, a general purpose technology is something that can be used to build other innovations, and on top of which different platforms can be built. The last such GPT that came out was the electricity, and after that the internet. And now the discussion has moved on to artificial intelligence as being the next GPT that is going to shape the next industrial revolution. And curiously so, China has definitely caught its attention. I remember in 2016 when the game of Go was happening, when He who was the world's topmost player after Lee Sedol had already lost, was supposed to hold a match with AlphaGo. In China, the live broadcast was blocked. And the reason, and this, what a New York Times report described, was the turning point with the Chinese politicians when they realized how important it was. My understanding why it was blocked was perhaps because A, this represented a game that was the heritage of China, and it also can hold possible combinations that are more than the number of atoms in the universe. And this was an American firm that was playing this sport. So it was sort of like a Sputnik moment for China in 2016. And upon that, after that, the State Council came up with the next generation artificial intelligence development plans. The topic of my presentation is a systemic analysis of China's next-gen AI development plan. And I have a unique advantage and disadvantage that I put both China and AI in a topic. Both of these elicited equal amounts of response from the audience and attention, which gives me a unique advantage. But there's also this disadvantage because there is so much noise on both these that when you combine them together, it's hard to separate the chaff from the grain. So the reason I put the word systemic in the topic was because what I see, what I've learned from my professors at Pedro, and what I've learned so far is that China's industrial policy is very much focused, and it takes a national innovation system approach. I explain upon it before I go further and discuss the plan, but these are three keywords in the title that I think through the presentation I would like to draw the attention towards. So 2018 started off to a very exciting start. When President Xi Jinping was giving his New Year's speech, there were two books that on his shelf caught the attention of the viewers. The first was King's Augmented, Life in the Smart Lane, and the second was The Master Algorithm by Domingos. So a Quartz reporter actually interviewed Domingos and asked him, how do you feel like one of the most powerful men in the world is reading your book? And his response was that I'm both excited and scared. And if I'm very honest, this is also my response. Living in Beijing, sometimes I'm in awe of the world we're living in. I don't carry any cash. I remember sitting in Shenzhen in a Putong toilet, and there's this facial recognition camera pointed at my face so that I don't steal toilet paper. I think it's part of Xi Jinping's toilet revolution. But there's so much happening right now that it asks for attention right now. And this news came out, I think, on July 31st. What it said was that now the foreign ministry is using artificial intelligence, using everything from gossip picked up on cocktail parties and satellite imagery to feed into decision making for the MA. Now this is a bit of a hype, I feel, and to be honest, like decision trees and game theory models have always been used in decision making by both corporates and other entities as well, but this is the kind of feed that is being pushed out. And may I mention, this was from the South China Morning Post, not from Xinhua or People's Daily or Global Times, which are usually more state dominant, influenced by the state. But it still caught my attention, and it was one of the most widely shared news items, at least in China, and on Facebook as well. So, going ahead of it, the way I structured this presentation is that I'll first explain what is the National Innovation System, what is this approach, and why it is important to understand this before we delve into the actual plan. Instead of calling the Next Generation AI Development Plan every time, I'll just be a little lawyery and call it the plan. And then I'll go on to explain the key elements as part of the plan before we head on to the concluding remarks. So, starting off with the system that I'm talking about, NIS, the systemic approach. This approach began in the 1980s, and it was then through the 1990s propagated by Freeman and Nerula. Did a lot of work on it, and it met a lot of resistance initially from the World Bank and the IMF in its initial years, but more recently we saw that a lot of European Union countries and OECD countries have been quoting this in their text when they discuss about how to build their innovation systems and how to look at new industries and new technologies that come up. And interestingly so, even the US Academy of Sciences has begun mentioning this approach so far. What the system actually talks about is that for socio-technical changes to take place, when we're trying to raise the production function of an economy, there needs to be a very close interaction of an industrial network. This may or may not be top-down or state-oriented. This is one major confusion that a lot of people have, but it's important whenever new technology is coming into place, or whenever there's a massive disruptive technology, what Schumpeter called it, is happening, there needs to be a system of innovation across the nation to influence macroeconomic change. In China, I feel like this is just taken to another extreme. To give an example, I just give an example of how I observed this. Just across from my university is Tsinghua, which is called the MIT of China. Now, the university there's an entity, separate entity called Tsinghua Holdings. This is completely owned by Tsinghua University, which makes it an SOE. Then Tsinghua Holdings owns 51% stake in a separate entity called Tsinghua Uni Group. The remaining 49% is owned by an investment firm called Beijing Jiankun Investment Group, which is also led by a man called Zhao Weikuo, who Forbes magazine described as the man spearheading China's chip ambitions. Now, this Tsinghua Uni Group is then funded by the MIIT, which created the National IC Investment Fund to the tune of around 1.6 billion. So what this Uni Group then does is, it goes to the US and tries to make a bid for Micron Technologies for $23 billion. Now this deal was then blocked by the Council for Foreign Relations in the US, but what the example this gives is that they're trying to get access from the outside into it. Then Tsinghua University creates specific programs designed to use this technology. Zhao Weikuo also is the head of the China High-Tech Semiconductor Development Association, or something like that. I think Alliance, not Association. And so there's all this interconnectedness between different entities and different institutions, which just magnifies the state. So when the order comes from all the way on the top, that, hi, we need to improve our semiconductor capabilities under Made in China 2025, all these cogwheels then start moving in the same direction or pushing each other. And this role of the state, I think, is also essentially what is causing the fusion between what the West views, what the US wants the role of the state to be, and what China expects it to be at the WTO. But having said this sort of a coordinated action is what I feel is amplified under this system of innovation. And what we'd also find is that in the reading of all the industrial policies and texts, when the US describes a policy, they advocate for open innovation. When China does it, it writes open and coordinated innovation, which is a very stark difference in how these two countries or two models, one calling itself permissionless innovation or bottoms up, even though it's very much the state, the DoD, DAPA and others have a big role to play in it, institutions have a big role to play in it, and this one being very top down. So this top down approach actually has pushed China a lot. Ethical and unethical, it's a different issue, but this whole system exists in how China perceives its innovation systems, and which I think is pretty interesting. So just going ahead to the principles that are outlined under the plan and how it begins. It starts by calling what the state that we've reached in globally as a strategic situation, and the focus of international cooperation in which China wants to have a first mover advantage. Though technically AI research began all the way in the late 50s and early 60s, and the term was first used in Dartmouth College, and the US has put an extensive amount of research time and energy, and institutions have done that for a very long time. But the Chinese want to put this out and adapt it into their economy to a more extent. And especially starting 2017, you've seen every time in the news, every time wherever one goes, there's so much attention being given to AI. The four key principles that they outline, based on which they hope to conduct this, is to lead technological explorations, to be a first mover, to formulate a targeted systems strategy, which comes from what concept we discussed, adherence to the rules of market orientation, because they've realized that a completely state-down approach does not work well, and advocating the concept of open source sharing. I come to this when we discuss about the open data sharing platforms that they're building. But under this, the targets that they've set up is that by 2020, they want the value of AI industry to be around 150 billion and associated industries to be around 1 trillion RMB, not US dollars. By 2025, the numbers go out to 400 billion and 5 trillion, and by 2030, they expect the AI industry in itself to be valued around 1 trillion. And the thing about the Chinese system is that when the states ask it, they just start putting in money. Two of my close friends who are working in the field of AI research, they went to a think tank in Shanghai to just present their research. The think tank said, after their presentation, please accept this money, we want to give it to you. And they said, no, we don't really want it, we just were sharing what our research was. But they forced them, please take, because they're being given funds from all the way top and they are supposed to spend that money. So I think we should take these numbers by a slight pinch of salt, but still they are big numbers. And the money is being pushed in through different channels, through LGFBs, through think tanks, through provincial governments, and right now the big boom, the big push from the Chinese government is coming in towards AI, and even what every industrial policy I think have so far is that there is a certain sense of gradualism when they design it, and all of them, like for example, this comes out from earlier national science and technology development plans, and they believe in first setting catch-up and then moving on towards building the basic scientific theories, which, remember, came out from the West, not from China. And by 2030, it says that they wish to form a mature new generation AI theory to achieve major breakthroughs in brain-inspired intelligence, autonomous intelligence, hybrid intelligence, and swarm intelligence, and intelligently apply AI technology to high-end industrial chains. So it's going to be a long time when we see these technologies actually changing or shifting the wheels in an economy, but the push is still there. Then the focus areas that are outlined under the plan. The first is to build an open and coordinated AI science and technology innovation system. I have this one quote from the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission that came up with a report called High Tech Development in China in November 2017, and I quote, "China has laid out an ambitious whole-of-government plan to achieve dominance in advanced technology. This state-led approach utilizes government financing and regulations, higher market access and investment barriers for foreign firms, overseas acquisitions and talent recruitment, and in some cases industrial espionage to create globally competitive firms." So, the same thing that China views as open and coordinated innovation system is viewed as a whole-of-government approach by Western countries, and that's an ideological difference as well. But you can't deny that there is the whole of government. I think it's a very aptly used usage of words, because that's what happens right now in China. So apart from that, I think the other ones to construct a safe and convenient intelligent society, strengthen military-civil integration, build a safe infrastructure system, and plan a new generation of AI major science and technology development projects. These focus areas, I'll expand upon them when we reach on the elements, because all of these are implemented through those elements. While discussing each of these elements, I'll explain what the strategy behind it is, what is the structure in which they've structured the plan, and what is the present situation in terms of what has happened so far. Just looking at research and development, so this is something very interesting. In China, most of the R&D funds go on the experimental development of technologies. There's not so much focus on basic research and applied research. What I mean by basic research is a focus on building scientific theories and algorithms, and applied research means putting that scientific research in a lab or two. But most of the R&D funding that has come out, this is not just for AI but in general, has been on experimental development. That is why you see why China relies on basic science so much from US and UK and Japan and other countries. And most of this fund actually comes from enterprises, which makes sense. When Baidu goes and sets up its R&D facility in Silicon Valley, it picks up that basic science from the US and then puts in money on the application as per the Chinese market in China. So it's a bit, while at least in the media, while a large numbers are often quoted on how much China is investing in R&D, a lot of this is on experimental development on application of that technology, which is also the reason why Chinese firms have tended to do so well recently, in recent years at least. But still, the plans, the 13th five-year plan and the next gen AI plan both recognize this deficit, and they do say that we would like to focus more efforts on university funding, and some of those cases have begun to show up actually. With China as well, I think this caused a lot of panic, at least among a lot of people, that the number of research papers that were coming out from China increased that from US as well. So a lot of, which goes on to show what's happening in the country right now, where everybody is just focused on AI, even if they might not necessarily be experts in it. But there's a catch to it here as well. Most of these research citations are actually self-citations. In China, 70% of the citations that have come out on AI have been by fellow researchers from within China as well. So does that research go out of the country and then create international standards, or do the standards or those technologies then remain within China? That is something questionable. And this is then also reflected in the H index score, which is a measure of how well this research is in terms of its productivity and citation impact. And in that, the United States actually fares a lot better. In fact, I think it was Times Education or Times Higher Education that did a report where it rated different universities on how well the research capabilities were. While MIT, I think, got a score of around 3.26 and Carnegie Mellon got around 2.53. The China Industry Alliance, which was the primary body for it, it's called the Institute of Automation of Chinese Academy of Sciences, which was the highest Chinese rating agency, got a score of 2.26. So even though there is a lot of push coming out, there's a lot of effort coming out from China, how well this research compares with US is questionable. Interestingly here as well, I have to say this, that surprisingly India does not fare as bad as we think. Our H index is a decent score. We're comparing with countries like Japan and the UK. Well, not UK, but at least with Japan. But this goes on to show that India has decent research capabilities, but we are not then putting them to use. Because it's not showing in how our industry functions or in our experimental development data. So I think this is how they've largely, what's happening with their R&D. And just if somebody is needed, I think I'll give some names of their major plans that they've set up. A lot of the industrial companies, organizations, like Oppo has set up the Oppo Stanford Collaboration Lab in Silicon Valley. Baidu had it a long time back, which was called the Baidu Silicon Valley Lab, and now they've set up the Baidu Deep Learning Lab in Beijing, and also the Baidu Data Lab. And what they're doing right now is that they're also focused a lot on creating open data systems. One of the, I think I'll just put a pin on this, one of the key facets about AI is that it has machine learning algorithms that are structured or unstructured. For unstructured algorithms, you need a lot of data to then make them run. China has the, and even India, has the unique advantage that we are large markets. We have a lot of data with us, and in an economy or in the revolution that happens, when data becomes a new fuel or something that can be monetized, China is making a lot of efforts to use that data. And that improves the algorithms that comes out of China. So this is one of the big advantages that China has over the US. And this is why their internet AI is much better than their business AI. I'll expand on it later. But there's a lot of focus on creating these open research platforms where anybody can access data and try to build algorithms or use that for research purposes, which is a very interesting thing, and I think it's something that India can also adopt once we figure out our data legislation issues that are still in the pipeline. Coming to civil-military technological diffusion, I think this is something that elicits a lot of interest. Institutions in general have always been given a lot of importance in creating a technical change. Even in the US, what we've seen post-Cold War, how the GPS and everything else, how the military played a role. I am using an iPhone right now, and literally I can count every one of the major technologies that is being used in this. There was some role that DARPA or DoD played. The LCD screen was created by a PhD researcher who was funded by a state. The Siri, which set Apple apart, was actually began as an AI assistant for military generals, which was put in place by the Stanford Research Institute, SRI. That's how it took its name. The GPS, which led to internet, was actually created after the Cold War, when the government wanted to be able to evacuate cities in case of a nuclear attack. So the military as an institution has always played an extremely important role in creating these new technologies, especially in the case where private capital will not put their money in. For example, if I say we're coming up with a fifth industrial revolution now and the fifth new technology, no private person will put in that money. But if a state institution finds an applicability of that technology, there's of course going to be some funding to it, and because it's a long run, the incubation of that technology is long drawn out. And the Chinese seem to realize that, which goes on to show how much effort they are now putting in creating civil military technology, diffusion, and industrial parks that are based out of universities. I think the first document that came out or publicly was read was in 2012, which was the document 37 under Hu Shengao. And what basically mentioned was it brought out the shift towards using civil military technology or dual-use technology in industrial parks that were also then run by the military. And this is being seen right now very, very practically. I'll give an example. In Anhui province, there is the Anhui Hefei High-Tech Industrial Zone that is sponsored by the military. Now, there are some very interesting startups that got incubated out of it. For example, iFlyTech. iFlyTech is one of the world's leading company in natural language processing, and in fact, it sits on MIIT's working group on technical standards for interactive Chinese language technology. And the same is observed with other companies like Hikvision that creates CCTV cameras. And now in a country where there's so much data, I feel that at least in facial recognition and natural language processing, China will probably take the lead, because it's pushing these all across, be it in Xinjiang, where Hikvision got so many contracts in Xinjiang to monitor the citizens, or iFlyTech, and the massive scale of data that goes into their databases just improves their algorithms too much, which is something I don't think the US has been able to do so far, what they're doing. I think I was telling this story to somebody before, well, I think I was doing this right now. Even in Putong toilets, there are those facial recognition cameras installed on streets. The CCTV cameras are everywhere. I think WeChat just introduced a speech-to-text feature. Sometimes I remember I gave a voice note to my friend saying I wanted to buy this thing, and the next day, I don't know how I got a suggestion on Taobao to buy that same product. So it's very interesting to observe these things, and my personal feeling is that at least these two companies are going to go ahead in NLP algorithms and facial recognition, which then by default leads to image recognition algorithms as well. So I think this top-down approach that the military has adopted is helping them in some way. There are a lot of other university collaborations as well. And just outside, just if I cross the road, there's Tsinghua University. Earlier last year, in June 2017, the Chinese Academy of Engineering in Tsinghua University, they announced that they would be setting up the Military Civil Fusion National Defense Peak Technology Laboratory at Tsinghua, which is aimed at coming up with these dual-use technologies. So how that impacts India in the long run is something that I'm also considering, because somebody recently told me that a lot of the CCTV cameras installed in government buildings come from Hikvision. So there are those concerns as well. Earlier, I think, just a month or 2 months ago, the news came out that the building that Huawei has built, the African Union building in Ethiopia, every night for the last 5 years, data was uploaded from the servers in that building to Shanghai. So while I do think that we need to catch up, and we need we need to get access to their technology as well. It's a very tricky situation that will probably land if we don't build on these technologies inherently. So this is one aspect that the plan puts a lot of focus on, and it's a specific focus task as well. Human resources. This, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that China has. Last estimate that I read was that in China there were around 50,000 researchers and people working on AI, whereas the US had around 850,000. Now these are big numbers, and this is a technology that requires a lot of skilled labor force. And the Ministry of Education has only recently now been looking at this very seriously. They've set up programs in colleges and universities and even schools to teach students programming. And in April 2018, the Ministry of Education in China set out 3 goals that they want to achieve by 2030. The first was to fundamentally optimize the infrastructure of colleges and universities to spark technical innovation and adapt the next generation of AI development by 2020, which I think they can still do because their infrastructure in Chinese is hallelujah. Develop achievements with a substantial global impact and deliver first-class theoretical research, innovation technologies and application by 2025, which is slightly doubtful because in order to build that, they need to have the absorptive capacity of these complex scientific theories, and they have not invested in that in the last few years. And the third is make Chinese colleges and universities the world's leading AI innovation centers and a hotbed for AI talent by 2030. This may or may not happen, but one has to agree that there is a lot of focus on universities right now because they're the hub of knowledge and also an easy way to get transfer of knowledge from the West. Apart from other major programs that they are trying to come up with, the most famous is the 1,000 Talent Program. I think if one looks around in Zhongwenzhen or in Chaoyang districts in Beijing, it's not rare to find a lot of foreigners whiteboard and walking around the streets. And it just feels like a lot more people are coming to Beijing and Shenzhen. Shenzhen is a completely different ballgame. It's a very global city, just like Shanghai and Hong Kong. And China is attracting a lot of highly skilled labor force now. Even my friends who've now tried to get a work visa, there's a new methodology for getting a work visa with skill A, B, and C. And the days when one could just come to China and teach English and then go back and stay there, I think that's going to change now. They're making the procedure to get a visa a little strict, and for highly skilled people with PhD degrees and advanced degrees in STEM courses, they're even offering benefits like a permanent residence visa for your maid that you can bring from your home country, and even she'll get some stipend. So those sort of incentives seem to be working, at least. A lot of very senior people, including Kai Fu Lee, who once used to head Google in China, has come back. In my university, they've set up, the Sinovation Ventures has set up a new program to train 500 teachers and 5,000 students on hard skills, hard AI skill sets. So they're also attracting Chinese citizens who used to work in the US very aggressively. In fact, there are industrial associations. For example, for semiconductors, there's the China-America Semiconductor Professional Association that holds 5-6 workshops each year, training events to bring back highly skilled Chinese people to work within the mainland. And then they have some national key innovation projects and key disciplines where more money is put into it. Alibaba has also helped in this regard. I think they recently set up something called Damo. An MIT paper said that they took that name from Dharma, but I don't know how true that is. But it's based out of Hangzhou, I think, and it's also focused at training talent. The next element, I think, is that of technology transfer. This is something that I think India has been trying to learn a lot from both East Asia and China. Earlier, the last approach that in the 12th five-year plan that they had was called the IDER approach, to introduce these Chinese companies to foreign technologies and what was happening outside, which you see there's so many roadshows that they do in foreign countries, to digest the technology, absorb it in the domestic market, and then re-innovate it to cater to the local market and also build their core technologies on their own, which is why sometimes universities like Tsinghua are so important. And the two orders that came out that were most important for this, that pushed this approach, was the measures on administrating overseas investments and measures on the administration and examination, approval and filing records for overseas investment projects. We saw how in 2016, Chinese investments, big Chinese industrialists went out and pushed and brought and made acquisitions to tunes of, I don't know, billions and billions of US dollars. That kind of black swans emerged in 2017, which caused some problem, and the PBOC put restrictions on how much money people who convert from yuan to dollars to be able to invest outside, and they're still monitoring it. That's why the investments went down. But for these, only for these specific technologies, these investments still continue to skyrocket. And a lot of time, these investments are actually providing funding by domestic banks, nationalized banks. For example, Media Group, which manufactures industrial robots and is a German company, KUKA AG was acquired by Media, and it got a lot of that debt from China Exim Bank. To, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was a loan of around $870 million US dollars, which is not a small amount for one company. And in the US especially, if one looks at from 2010 to 2017, the amount of funds that have gone on to try and acquire US AI companies has been exploding throughout. And this, I feel, for what we're seeing right now, the repercussions, how the trade war is more so actually a technology war. And it's also interesting here because you see a lot of the presidential orders or blocking of deals by the CFIUS are based on national security grounds, which also has a resonance in, I think, the change in WTO or China's status on the WTO from a market economy to a non-market economy, so they can't easily impose duties. But this is a serious concern for the Americans right now. So technology transfers play a big role in China AI. The internationalization of R&D by private Chinese firms like the BAT, and now even Hikvision and iFlyTech, causing some serious concerns in the West. With the Belt and Road, I don't think it's going to impact a lot. In fact, I think it's more so a commercial transaction rather than a technological one. One very important element that I think often gets neglected in discussion in India is AI plus X. What the program does is that it points out the use of other technologies, other very critical industries that help in building the domestic AI industry. Semiconductors being the first of them. So the algorithms that AI algorithms run, they're extremely big and complex algorithms, and they often require not the normal CPUs but advanced GPUs that are based on designs that are often taken from the human brain that basically allows data to transfer within the chip very quickly between different components of the chips. So it's a whole new different ballgame. And semiconductors, in fact, is China's Achilles heel right now. Of all the total chips that it's used, it manufactures only 16% of it domestically, and it spends around $200 billion annually on importing different ICs. And the Chinese desperately are looking for more chips right now. And you see this in the trade tensions as well, how the ZTE saga played out, which is a big manufacturer, how with China blocking the Qualcomm NXP deal, or they've been trying to acquire Micron technology since forever, and I think earlier this year they passed an anti-draft regulations against Micron. So this is an extremely critical thing because they don't have the technology right now domestically, and they are reliant on on acquiring patents from outside. By the way, China spends a lot of money on acquiring patents from globally, which is a large part of its balance of payments. So what it did, in 2014, it came up with the National Integrated Circuit Industry Fund, which is maintained by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And it began with a registered capital of around 98.7 billion RMB. Within this, then they had different players, as I said, in a whole system approach, private entities, different ministries all coming together and try to have some access. The Ministry of Finance plays a role. The China Development Bank has a 22.9% stake in it, and this money is often lent out sometimes for research and sometimes for foreign acquisitions. Just in semiconductors, I think to the US, the total number of proposals that were made was to the tune of $34 billion, out of which the CFIUS allowed only $4 billion worth of acquisitions to be passed in semiconductors. So it's really the bone of contention right now, and this is also why it's one of the most important priority industries under Made in China 2025. But having said that, they still have managed to build some high power processing GPUs. Some of the chips that they've come up with is the Unicorn and Cambricon, which raised funding of around $100 million in 2017, and they came up with its first cloud-based chip called the MLU100, which is a newer version of its previous chip, for which it had actually spent a considerable amount of money acquiring a patent from a Silicon Valley-based company called Arteris that allowed the patent was about how to transfer data within the chip. So that's happening, and then in the mobile space, to allow mobile, because a lot of internet consumption in China comes from mobile. So a lot of these AI apps is more important for China than for the US and other countries. Spectrum is making some strides, and it came up with its octa-core LTE SEO chip. Before that, they had built the Tianhe 2, which was built with the help of Intel actually. The inputs were taken from Intel. So they are trying to build on there's some focus on building these semiconductors, but they're really struggling. And it's a major cause for trade tension between the US and China right now. Now big data systems. This is another very important side technology that is required for the success of AI. You need to be able to store and then process this data on some cloud service, because these are large chunks of data, then feed your algorithms. I have this quick video. I think one of the places I went to Quito, and Quito is being brought about in China as the big data valley of the country. And so the officials were showing us this video, and I managed to just record it. What they're doing is that they've created a whole valley to bring in investments in big data, and they're setting up data centers. Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent have all already set up their centers inside mountain caves. Apple is supposed to open it by 2022. And by the way, this is one of the most poorest provinces, the second most poorest province in China. And we were being shown how the police is using the system. This is a video from AlphaGo that really changed their mind, to collect all this data, and they were very proudly showing how they are able to sit at one place and monitor different citizens, and the response time was very good. But essentially what's happening is that they're trying to keep all their data within the country, which then allows them to build their algorithms on top of that data and monetize it. With India, this is a problem. Just to showcase, I think I'll just skip forward a bit. Cheery pictures of happy people, industrial robots, the technology being used in payments and agriculture, driverless cars, so on and so forth. and has really received a lot of push from the government. I was going through this data for this province, and it's showing a growth rate of around 15% right now, which is much higher than what the national GDP growth rate is. So big data systems is a huge part of their AI plan, and a lot of money being put into this as well. Finally, 5G networks. The best example I always give to explain 5G is to go back in history and look at during the Eisenhower administration when they passed the National Highways Act. What that act did was that it helped create lines and lines of infrastructure, which then led to the rise of the automobile industry. 5G as a concept is the same. It's very important and required for the new IoT and AI industries because it provides a low latency and a very high-speed system. If we want our driverless cars to run using an AI algorithm, you can't expect the data to be monitored to come to it up with a 2-second lag. It has to be extremely quick and precise. For industrial robots is extremely important because all these industrial robots then work with each other. Unmanned aerial vehicles require to be able to communicate to the satellites and other places. So a lot of focus being pushed on 5G networks. And until recently, Huawei and ZTE were major players in this space. But ZTE seems to have been shaken a bit. But Huawei is still going strong. A few friends who are working as political consultants for Western companies like Qualcomm recently told me that Western firms are actually now trying to play down their capabilities to be able to just not get the attention. They're taking the gun shopping approach by bidding their time and not wanting industrial espionage to take place or attract any unnecessary attention. Mr. Mittal from Airtel was in Beijing in South Korea, and he was exploring a lot of these East Asian economies. So I feel like the boom seems to be happening on one hand on Qualcomm on the west, and then in Korea and China on the east. This might cause us a bit problems in terms of what kind of standards we run into, like happened with the European and US GSM and CDMA. But both sides are now coming up very aggressively. In a major breakthrough that happened was in December last year, when 3GPP, the third generation something partnership, which is responsible for, which is a body under the ITU that is a consortium of different industrial groups and countries responsible for setting standards. It released its first set of standards for non-standalone systems. Post that, everybody has just been rushing in to come up with their new standards and try to come up or just get something out on 5G, get more contracts signed. So this again gets some resonance in the AI development plan as well, which lays emphasis on these complementary technologies that is required for the building of a comprehensive national AI ecosystem. Just as concluding ways, I think a lot has been written on the race between the US and China. My sense is that, so Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, who used to head Google in China at one point of time, and now is heading Sinovation Group, he defined the different levels of AI as Internet AI, Business AI, Perception and Autonomous AI. While we've not reached on the last two, China, just because it has such a high digital penetration and such large number of users, is much better right now in terms of its Internet AI. In terms of the mobile apps that we use and how live streaming, video streaming apps are working, whereas the US has, just because of its stronger industrial foundations, is performing much better on business AI, especially because they have the semiconductors to create industrial robotics. So it's slightly better off on that front. What does it mean for India? Under the ITO, there's a committee called SC42, which is responsible for setting the standards. Its first meeting was held in Beijing, and China has been aggressively pushing its standards at this committee as well. Nothing concrete has happened so far. There's only 1 or 2 meetings. The second is happening in DC now. But the China Electronic Standardization Institute is a part of it. So it might be a tricky situation where some standards are built in the East and some in the West. And how then we interact with it, which ones do we buy? I think only time will tell us. The BRICS, the only, so I tried to think about what are the ways where India can try and partner up with China. Privately, a lot of players, at least industrialists, I think, right now are focused on partnering up or importing that technology. We don't have, while we have a lot of investments coming in from China, we're not getting a lot of technology transfer from here, from this side. Now, if this technology is being built here, we need to have some sort of interaction with them. I think some positive efforts were made recently when with Dalian we started the IT corridor. With the same IT corridor was now set up with Pedro, the same place that I'm showing the video of. And what they do is that they put on the queries in Chinese, and Indian IT companies can then, it gets translated and they work here. I don't know how much this has been applied because it just began, but some novel approaches of technological sharing or just a comprehensive access is being built. A lot of Chinese live streaming apps are actually trying to come into India because what's happened is that live streaming is huge in China. Most people just make videos and they pass it around in apps, but they've reached a saturation level. They've acquired so many users. Now to get the next round of VC funding, they need more users to it, daily active users. Now where do they get that? Which is the only market as big as China, it's India. So a lot of these video streaming and media agencies are trying to set up their offices in India, but they're setting up branch offices or project offices or LOs. They're not really, this data is again going out to servers in China, not really staying here. So I'm still wondering how this will play out. Maybe we need to come up with something. We need to first come up with our own data laws and our own AI policy before then we can try and complement with these guys. But the BRICS 2017 had a science, technology and innovation framework in which they said that they're going to focus on combined research. Again, how much that materializes, can't really say because they're not going to share this technology with their open hearts. But still, the biggest thing that India can take away from it is to use this as a case study and build an innovation system of its own. I think we have great advantages, the biggest one being that we have a large market of data which runs this entire industry and will run the industry of the future. Our consumer markets are, if you look at consumer shares, they're growing at 20%. So we need to do what we perhaps need to do, I'll leave this to the policymakers to think, what China did when companies wanted to enter China just for its market. We need to put these systems into place. I think just next week, India's new industrial policy is going to the cabinet for approval. The last industrial policy came out in '91. We have to see what this new industrial policy does, and when it comes out, what it does for tech transfers and what it does for improving our own innovation systems. But the least we can do is to use China as a case study, is at least what I think. And I think that's all what I have, but open to questions at this time. Thank you.
Excellent presentation. And I think one can't help comparing the creation of a national innovation system in China with what the Japanese attempted. There are quite a large number of parallels, and I think it will be of some use. I'll just make some brief comments and close the floor open to this audience. What we call as the lost decades begin sometime in 1990s, and that is a major shock to the Japanese. 2 decades following 1992, you really don't have any real growth in Japan. And this is the time there is huge amount of soul searching in Japan, and they start rebuilding, completely overhauling their national innovation system. And the Chinese seem to have picked up a huge number of lessons from that. What the Japanese found out is that there is tremendous lack of coordination between a large number of stakeholders who are involved in the national innovation. So they've been working on it. For example, the creation of technology policy, then the base institutions involved in R&D, and thirdly, the Ministry of Education, which is responsible for human capital creation. The kind of coordination between these three was absolutely lacking. So tinkering with that was the first thing that the Japanese attempted. Ultimately, it boils down to optimal utilization of resources. And this is the time, you talk about the knowledge economy. So when you're talking about knowledge economy, it was a quick shift to AI from there. Because ultimately what happens is, how do you handle big data? How quickly you are able to crunch huge amount of data, make sense out of it, and put it into some application. I think that is the crux, right? So for that, the kind of human capital that the Japanese required and the way they attempted, gets reflected in a number of things that you presented. The kind of state role and the kind of private sector initiative that the Chinese are 2 steps ahead of the Japanese. The Japanese have overhauled. You see, the important thing is this. 1990s, the Japanese are on top of a number of technology fields. But then they discovered they had to start from ground zero again. And they did that. So now the Japanese have created certain technologies where they are absolute masters in the world. The US is way behind. There are certain sectors where there is absolutely no match to the Japanese even today, despite the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector in Japan, etc. So I think there is the key is coordination between the stakeholders. The key is resource optimization, and the key is the time is of complete distance when you're talking about AI. You have huge amount of data, how quickly you are able to crunch it, make sense out of it, put it into some application and market it. And that is where, when you talked about the Chinese focusing on not basic technologies, but what you called as experimental technologies, and then I think you included applied technologies also. Precisely the same thing the Japanese did when they borrowed technology from the US in a major way, starting from 1955 onwards. Right? They focused on the application end of the spectrum, and that is why they reached where they are today. Right? I think with that, I leave the floor to questions. Yeah, please.
Ravish, I think an excellent presentation, and I think so you summed up also very well. Well, I just have a thought which I want to provoke you with. See, we have great talent, and when I'm talking of talent, I'm not only talking of talent in India 186. The head of DARPA is in India, Arti Prabhakar, born in Nagpur. I'm just giving you one out of I think 144 scientists in DARPA, about 61 are of Indian origin. I'll give you a comparison now and come to it. Way back, we could not have bypasses in the medical field, and we were terribly off. Anybody wanted a bypass, he was heading for the United States. Even a beggar was heading there if he could get this thing and search from the Indian Foreign Service. We did a great thing. We got all these Naresh Trihan and all these people back, and we got them at a price, if I may say. We gave them concessions which were possibly even today not out, luckily, in the open domain. Because knowledgeable people are made in Delhi, in the Delhi University where you are, and then they go, and then they become US citizens. There must be a way to ascertain that basic research continues in the Silicon Valley and the experimental model continues in India. if we can do that, we have done that in the medical field in a big way. That's why you have today all these great doctors. I'm just giving it. This has happened in a very secretive way, or shall we put it that nobody has bothered much about it, and no, even the media has not focused much attention on it. Maybe because possibly it didn't have any political fallout. And in India, I think people can die and it makes no difference, really speaking. We haven't reached that level where today somebody dies on the road and it's a big issue on CNN or something. Like there, a BMW knocks out, that chap is roaming around today freely. He's not even in jail, he's on bail as a matter of fact. So what I'm getting at today is, if we don't do that, then I think we can keep on having such presentations from you. And this is what China did, those 4 steps you beautifully brought out. Having the companies firstly to, what you call, understand what a foreign technology is. Next is to absorb it. Thirdly is to experiment with it. I don't think, I dealt with AI. I've been a practitioner, I do not want to come out with it. If you take unmanned aerial vehicles, I think we were one of the first guys, and the army got it before the Air Force. We did everything, but today when we wanted even a single component, it had to come from Israel or the United States. One screw had to come. That is our level of technology, I'm just sharing with you. One screw has to come from the United States or Israel, and there's nothing else we could do. I mean to say, and then I put Israeli people here. Their security is a big, there are issues on issues which keeps multiplying. So I'm only suggesting, is that possible? You are in China, you know the United States. Is there a way of getting this great human talent, at least on a partial basis over here? They work over here. We've got people in the economic fields coming. They come as Governor RBI, they're back again to Chicago, they come to Niti Aayog, they are back. But in the scientific field, I find that DRDO, maybe ISRO also is somewhere where we are managing with possibly Russian help. But I don't think we're getting our talent. Without that, I don't think we can do what serves. I leave it to you.
I think you asked a very tough question, and I don't know if I can answer.
No, please, you can answer.
I completely agree with that. I did my bachelor's as an engineer, and most of my friends today decided to pursue an MS and then stay back on a STEM visa, which they get an OTP, and sessions like these because they come from STEM backgrounds. Back there, even if today I look at, say for example, if I want to get a job here, how much I'm recognized here. I'm speaking in a very layman language, I'm not doing any fancy principles here. But there needs to be, I think, some level of monetary incentive to come back, because the opportunities are below and they have been below. I remember since the time I was in class 5, I've been hearing about this word called reverse globalization, but it's only rarely that one gets to see that, right? I think the best thing that India can do right now, which it's trying to do, is to increase more technology transfer through FDI. I think the government was at least very, very right in trying to put that out as a priority. How much that has changed India's productivity or production function is a question of debate. But we really do not have, we have very basic problems first that we need to solve that can then lead to industry, and which can then lead to people coming in. For these new technologies, we are very undervalued. We don't know first, for example, just talking in on this technology, we don't even have a fixed data rules yet. We don't know what to do with it, how to deal with it, because I think just if one has been reading the newspapers with pink color in the last few weeks, they've been saying how the e-commerce policy is biased, or data law of the Sri Krishna Commission report has flaws in it. I think to some degree they're very justified in trying to bring data back and then create those data laws first, because they're going to fuel new technologies. Then on top of that, I think there needs to be more incentives, monetary incentives that come out with the government, and they don't need to be on political subjects, like for example, I'll give to somebody who was telling me that one of the research establishments of the military came out with a sort of a lubricant that one can apply to and that will repel mosquitoes for 30 days. It's a great innovation, but why? And it took 10 years to come up with that. But why do you need it when you can put another ointment every day, right? So there needs to be a very serious shift in our focus on high valued industry, which is missing right now. When those industries come in, then it will lead to other innovation systems popping up. And then, of course, I definitely think that the military needs to have a stronger role in engineering. I find it very difficult. We can put 90 satellites on the moon, but we still need to buy fighter jets every time when one goes out to just please European countries or other countries. We're sort of like trying to buy their support, I feel. So I know very little about this, but when Mr. Vikram Sarabhai came in, there was a huge shift and there was a massive focus to build a particular industry, and in those industries, especially space, India did extremely well, which goes on to show that it can happen. But that has sort of remained like in a silo, in a different entity of its own, operating very separately from the rest of the economy. So I think the government knows how to do it, but how to change what's happening, I really can't answer that question. Please.
One or two small remarks and questions connected to that. You see, technology is something which actually has to have an objective. You do not really start developing a technology in vacuum. So far as I can see, the applications of artificial intelligence in China, they're mostly either in the tracking kind of systems or in the systems which are mostly related to really surveillance kind of technologies, facial recognition, etc., etc. Since you have been there for how many years now? I don't know.
Just a year.
Just a year. So, what is your sense where this development of AI is going in China beyond the surveillance and the cognitive kind of technologies really? I ask this question simply because, like he said, in the case of India, eventually you graduate to the higher level of technology when you find there is an application for it, or you are thinking. So what drove this artificial intelligence research? It's surely this kind of an investment cannot be just for the sake of glamour, or as I call the sexiness of it, really, that yes, we got to have this technology. Chinese are very, very, they determine the wise people in that the investment really goes in the areas where they see there's some kind of a return, if not now, 20 years down the line. So your sense of where this get to, number one. Number two, I've dealt with the people coming here to India for research, not always in the scientific and technological area, but in history, etc., etc. And we have always looked at them with some suspicion as to what they are up to really. Even the USA, many of my friends from the Delhi University, good minds in physics and physics primarily, they are working in highly classified defense laboratory, and they need to go through multiple layers of security clearances related to work in those. What is the system in China? Tsinghua now, like the MTI, Tsinghua is one of the best scientific science university anywhere in the world, in fact, not just in China. So when people from abroad, they come to work on science projects, I mean, do they also need to have clearances, security, etc., or are they openly accepting their invited to work on the projects? How does it happen there? I know there are some of my colleagues retired from the government who are now working on climate technologies there in China. So how does it happen? And lastly, what made you choose to come to Tsinghua University?
He's at Peking. He's at Peking, Yenching. Opposite his university.
Competitors. Thank you for the questions. The first question was going beyond where and why did they decide to invest these large sums of money where they're putting these industries as 1 trillion by just AI as 1 trillion, which is around 3% of China's current GDP, RMB, not dollars. I think the applications that they see is much more. For example, I remember just before coming back to Delhi last month, on TV it came the news that they put a live description of a competition between doctors, advanced doctors, the best doctors, oncologists from all over China, versus an AI robot in diagnosing tumors in different parts of the body. And the AI algorithms won 2-0. They had an efficiency rate of 80%, the doctors had around 60-61%. So healthcare is a massive, big system. Driverless cars seem to be getting a lot of push. There's a very interesting startup called Memento something. I remember one of my friends interning there. And so there are a lot of these applications that are also now beginning to show up. That's why I first said that this is a general purpose technology on top of which new innovations will come up. When the steam engine was built in the last industrial revolution that happened, we didn't realize that how it will take shape in the next 100 years. But there is a very common consensus right now globally that this, based on just how we're seeing it, how this will come up. But even in this, there are different progressions to it. What I think the basic layer, I think we're talking of sometimes we digress and start talking about artificial general intelligence or super intelligence, but we're slightly a bit far away from that. But even at the bottom layer of the pyramid, I think a lot of these are on my phone right now, and even not just facial recognitions. Those are definitely because the money is spent to purchase that technology by the government. So there's no doubt that they're good at it, but I think they're also doing well in other spaces. The applications, I think somebody with better qualifications than me can detail out how it will shape up. But broadly, the consensus is there. What drove them? I think a sense of techno-nationalism is extremely strong right now. I think when I see myself as an Indian, I remember last time another country was at the forefront of an industrial revolution, we spent 200 years literally spending pathetic years in our history. The Chinese, I think, also recognize the importance of it. That's why they say we want to be at the forefront of these innovations, and they very specifically mention it. And because they realize that the countries, the economies that hold the technological power, I think we moved away from a Pax Americana state where the technologies that they held, then that led to their growth of economy. They realized that this is what it's going to take for them to be the world's #1 economy. So in the minds of the Chinese politicians, it's a sense of techno-nationalism that is driving them, which is extremely strong. And I think I said, when they saw a Western company algorithm defeating the best player, Bhatia, in a game that they had mastered for 3,000 years, it was like a sarcastic thing for a lot of politicians. Suspicion and clearances, I think the suspicion is there every time. The monitoring is on, I think, throughout. I don't want to know if I should say this on camera or not, but if you remember, there was a migrant crisis happening in Beijing. Some students in our university, I think, discussed on WeChat to be able to then just go out and see what's happening, and the next day they were apprehended by the university authorities. So it's not like everybody knows that you're coming here and they're being monitored. The suspicion is there. but people are still coming over. And then there's a sense of how much people feel suspicious versus, and so this is, I think, a lot of foreigners tend to focus on this. The Chinese people, I don't think they feel threatened that their privacy is being watched. Or this. There's a difference between freedom index and this, how much you feel perceived freedom index, right? So that is very different. For the foreigners coming in, it's very open right now. Of course, there are some places where there's some racism, but I think for the highly skilled ecosystems that are in place, it's extremely open. As I mentioned, in Zhongwansun or in Haitian in general, or in Chaoyang, which are the major districts, there are just too many foreigners just go in everywhere. So which goes on to believe that it's becoming more metropolitan, and they understand that. They understand that they have to open up. They remember the opening up of the Chinese economy in the days gone by, and understand that it's important for them to learn those skill sets. And there are a lot of incentives that are given. What made me go there, I think I fell in a similar category. A lot of people come to China to now learn the language, and I feel there's a whole section of the population that went to once learn Russian or Japanese. There are a lot of people trying to understand the country or just do business with it. My reasoning was that we listen and we read that China will be the #1 economy, India will be the #3 economy by 2030. So why do we all want to go and move towards the West? This was just my understanding, and I was generally curious about China. The more I delve deeper into it, the more curious I get every day, because it's changing. The way of living is very different there when I compare it to here. The shared economies, for example, being a major example, the shared bikes everywhere. A lot of things, applications happening at present on scale.
So if I may say, the major issue is the military requirement for this subject. You have today Chinese robots fighting robots. These are things which are available in their domain. You have swarms coming in. The lady was discussing with you. So swarm, 500 UAVs will attack, say, Delhi University.
And swarm intelligence is where...
So your entire cyber warfare is AI. So today military applications, if you want to be a superpower, this is all that you need. You don't need to fight only. There might be some robots who come over here in an invisible form, knock all of us out, and go back. You don't know who has done
that is not even needed, sir. I think, for example, Xi Jinping has put a lot of emphasis on cyber building. There was for something that I do for a different agency. There was a client who sits at the board of a major electronics company in the US, and he wanted to understand if there can be more cyber warfare on this company. And I think that when these political tensions happened, Daimler 2-3 days ago released in its profit statements that its profits had been impacted because of the trade war, and it made a political statement. Its servers were hacked, and interestingly, that hack actually came from the servers in Xinhua, which was actually the most shocking thing, because if that comes out, it changes the game a lot. And cyber, Xi Jinping has put a lot of emphasis on cyber. We were discussing Israel, and if one needs to attack, say, any other country, you can target its financial stock markets, you can just put down its, you can twist the walls in a dam, and then a whole thing will flood away an entire city. You can, the stock markets, the electricity grids, and a lot of these electronic equipments, I'm saying, we're actually importing from China because they're being built there. So I can't say what we can do about it, except for...
Absolutely. In fact, that is the point.
That is why they're going. So you're right. Why should they invest money?
That's a point I was making, that one of my friends who was with me actually in the college, not with me in the college, but I was part of the science talent group till 75, after the MSc. And this guy was in Chandigarh, and he is now working in the defense lab in San Alamo in the USA. And he had come to speak at the ORL. One or two takeaways that I still recall from what he said is that number one, most of the technologies that developing artificial intelligence at the moment is really in the security area, defense technologies, most of it. Number two, even when they diversify it to apply to, like you're talking about the doctors, the robot doctor who is diagnosing and everything. It was actually quite a scary thought that once all this is in place, around 70% of the population is going to be redundant. When the 70% of the population goes redundant, basically because all you need is just a small number of people to work as a labor. The brains, again the labor is really all automated now. A few brains to guide them, and the rest are really free to do what they want. In fact, for them to be really part of the labor force can create obstacles because they will be rather being disruptive than contributing. So it's funny, but the idea was that should they not be retired, given sufficient social welfare funds, go to the beach, enjoy yourself, just don't interfere, don't come near us, let us do what we are doing to. Now with China, that's the USA, in China, where there is a huge number of population and a large number of it is now skilled actually, or they're skilling more and more. When you go to use the artificial intelligence in other areas, what impact is it going to have on the workforce, the labor?
China doesn't have that many beaches either.
Exactly. So what are they going to do? Unrest?
So I got a paper, AI will have more use, will require more employment. AI will result in more employment because the robots would need, as he said, so they need very high level of what is this? He didn't use internet. What is the next thing that you use?
IoT.
Internet of things will have to be used. You'll have a lot of people in it. It would be, we will be in a different, you would require 5 times the amount of people with the artificial intelligence. It is like computers came in and somebody said in Calcutta, I remember, they broke all the computers in Hong Kong, Shanghai Bank because this is the employment. That was the CPM government. Today with computers we are needing more professors, more, so with science you need more people. You may not have pilots on aircraft, I'm just saying this. But that aircraft like today, I just want to share with you, I just came in a metro, there's a line known as Magenta line. So I took it from a military place, Shankar Vihar, just to see because my house used to be there and no civilian is allowed to go in from there. It came without a driver. Now they didn't announce it, they were just, I want you know, the metro today of your Delhi, which is next to you, actually is working on Wi-Fi. The driver is just sitting, so it came without a driver. I observed it, so when I got down, I again ran to see that does it have horse cars. Because from horse cars I had to take another metro to come to civil lines. I just wanted to see, was I wrong? It was without a driver, it was going from Janakpuri West up to Botanical Gardens in Noida on the Magenta line. Now they are not announcing it, they are putting some drivers, maybe some driver is on sick or something, but they are, but someone, actually the metro is being controlled from a station. Now that station, sir, I have dealt with UAVs. If you need one pilot for an aircraft, a UAV will be flying for 18 hours. You need 3 pilots because the person gets very tired looking at this. You look at this laptop, you control it. How many periods can a teacher take, sir? So same way, you need 5 times the amount of manpower if AI comes in.
I don't know if that will be the case or not.
They have worked it out.
But I don't disregard the value of humans. And there's this one story how I think during the Cold War there was a Russian submarine in which there were these 3 people who were responsible in case they were ordered to launch a nuclear attack. So what happened was, and I'm trying to remember that there's a book called Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark in which he puts this across. The order came in, I think, because of some radar problem, or they thought that the order came in was to launch a nuclear machine. 2 people agreed to do it, and there was 1 human who stopped it. So it was human ingenuity, and I think this man is given less importance. I don't remember his name, which goes to show. But the world would have looked very differently if it wasn't the human decision-making ability. With UAI is now that's an ethical question, right? When you use swarm intelligence, you don't necessarily need those many people controlling those robots, right? So, and then they're making decisions on their own, but can they solve those ethical questions or not? Then there are a lot of other biases as well. For example, the data that we feed in, say for example, if in India we feed in data on whether to give credit based on the credit capabilities, and you put in columns like the class SC, SC, ST, it has an inherent bias in it that this person might not give back my loan. So if you're using an AI-based system in a financial system, by the way, financial markets AI, very, 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 very high practical applicability. So these are biases which need human ingenuity. There's a book by Cathy O'Neill called Weapons of Math Destruction that talks about the inherent biases that these algorithms, these unstructured algorithms that we're building, they possess, and why you need humans in some level.
Just see, it's difficult to really appreciate what is AI, and for the layperson, I'm a layperson. When you're trying to understand that, some examples. So something that I read. So there is a machine system which has been fed with what we call as expert systems. Various expert ideas are fed into it, and it knows how to handle it, etc. So that computer is played against a human, and a simple question was asked. The question that was asked is, there are two clocks. One has stopped. The other one is going 1 minute late. Okay, which one should be preferred? Okay, and what is that reason? So the human naturally picks up the one which goes 1 minute late. So it's 1 minute late, you can compensate. And the computer said that that's absolutely wrong. You should go for the one which has stopped. Okay, what is the reasoning? The reasoning is that twice in 24 hours you get the exact time. Whereas to get the exact time, you have to wait for, it worked out, 2,342 years and so many days, so many hours to get the exact time if you use the
definitely don't go with that exact time.
That is machine, so maybe human intelligence ultimately is
accuracy and precision.
So we can, please.
Well, very good presentation. Just a couple of simple questions. When you were talking about focus areas, you used this, you said one of them was forcefully develop new AI industries. Why did you use the term forcefully? That's the question. And second question is, you also said that AI courses are now being introduced in universities. Are they part of engineering programs, or they are, it's a separate discipline in itself? So a little bit on that, if you are aware.
The reason for using the word forces was because it's a supply side push. There might not necessarily be a demand for it, but as with every other industry, for example, high-speed rail, where a lot of them are not actually profitable, but we've seen, and that's why Jawahar talks about supply-side reform now. But it's a supply-side push, and the government realizes it, that as they keep pushing in this technology, they expect that the demand will come in at some point in time. So they're forcing that technology. It's not the privacy for being forced or data being collected that forced. The second question was in the universities. The first is, of course, teaching a lot of algorithms, and very importantly, I think what's important is, for example, to have a cross-disciplinary education model with AI. For example, if somebody wants to implement, because it's a general purpose technology, right? If one wants to invent something that works with healthcare, they need to be able to study some pieces of healthcare. They need to be able to understand what is the law surrounding data, what they can do and what they can't do. And we were discussing this with somebody from Niti Aayog, and they realized this as well. In fact, 2 months ago, Niti Aayog came up with a discussion paper, not a policy paper, in which they mentioned cross-disciplinary learning, and that is reflected in the Ministry of Education's plan as well. So that is one thing. So it is taught not just in engineering courses, but engineering courses then take other courses as well. Then another source of learning is the different labs that are set up in universities. And these labs are often run by private players, sometimes by military. And in general, this is my view, I think that universities in China tend to collaborate a lot with the American universities. Like we have a Stanford Center in Bhatia, and then there's a lot of collaborative events that keep happening. Like one would get tired going to a number of events that keep
Are they
happening.
giving degrees in artificial intelligence or things like that?
I'm not too sure they are at the moment. But the plan that they launched in April 2018 is to train colleges and universities and to set up that infrastructure to train them, because they also need access to a large amount of data to be able to train these students on those skill sets. So this came out in April. I think very soon they might come up with something like that. But in the West, how they do it is they put it under computer science, and even economic students take courses in machine learning.
It's under computer sciences, I can say, in the United States. It's under computer sciences. Nothing happens in the US unless your university does it. It is the basic institution. I mean, say, even the military, I mean, say, just want to share with you, in India, we've got how many? We've got 3 military institutions. In the US, we've got 25 military institutions lying within the university. See, Delhi University will have an Indian military academy. If you go to Texas, A&M, there's a military college which gives commission to military officers. So the whole idea is the captain comes back for a PhD. And then he is not a person who's in an isolated world. He belongs to the world see, the world creates us by schools, universities, and artificial intelligence is normally, as you said correctly, in the computer sciences. All universities, what you call, which are dealing with science, basic sciences there, and of course the Silicon Valley, as you said, is the basic place for research. Undoubtedly, ma'am, all research is happening there.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Ravish. My question is regarding to, in the Indian context, we seem to have different, especially state-led, like, you pointed out, space, defense, and others, who do cutting-edge research. A while ago, I read, like the way you're pointing out about mosquitoes, I read about how, due to our necessity in operating in the Siachen Glacier, they invented a biodigester which will digest and process the waste which is being produced, biological waste produced there, and in that extreme conditions, very cold and less oxygen and other things. So, and then they say like that they intend to bring that technology onto our trains, and I've never seen that in the Indian trains. Can you comment a little bit on how it appears, say, in the US defense sector did a lot of training, they did a lot of innovation, and then it spilled out. Is it something to do with maybe, I don't know, like I'm reducing it by like some democratic culture, or maybe it does in India, maybe like we have far more state-led development still, despite all the economic reforms. Is there a difference, that might have? So our space program, like you said, it's good, but we seem to have like 4 or 5 really cutting edge and then abject poverty. So can you comment a little bit on the larger state culture, maybe that the US has been so successful?
I think the success for US technology began with transfer from Europe to US, especially to the UK, after the Industrial Revolution, and then the next major boom came during and after the World War, which was a lot of times when they trained a lot of students. Basically, they trained all the people in different technologies during the war. Then when soldiers came back, they started the public university system in which everybody was then sent to school and then taught these new skill sets. The DARPA and DoD, they made some of the biggest investments in Silicon Valley. And some of the critical technologies evolved through that, even the internet that we talk about. So there is no doubt that the United States as an institution as well puts in a lot of energy and money in promoting technological innovation there as well. And every state does that. If you would like to go into the details of it, there's a very interesting book by Mariana Mazzucato. It's called The Entrepreneurial State, in which he describes how the US government spend a lot of energy and gives different examples as well of different industries. The example of the iPhone, I think, I came from that book. And it's a very good case study on the US, which actually gives out case by case for GPS, screens, semiconductors, and a lot of other such critical technologies.
Anybody else? Any comments, questions? Yeah. I think it was extremely interesting. What is the takeaway for us from your presentation? The takeaway, as I see, I would like to end on a positive note. We are way behind China in a number of areas. That comes out clearly. But for our strengths, I think this mindset also has to change. It's easy for us to criticize ourselves, and I think Indians are extremely good at looking down upon Indians. We have positives, we have strengths. It was in 2006 that we did a report on outsourcing for AC. Then we discovered that 15% of the entire top-level IT workforce, which was involved in R&D, of all the top US IT companies, were based out of Hyderabad and Bangalore. It was 15%.
Yeah.
This is 2006, and the percentage has been increasing. These people create IT, sitting inside India. These are Indians too. Okay, so it could be 20%, 25% of the. So the entire top-level workforce in the whole world is so much percentage of it is sitting in India. Around that time, one of the contributors to the report, he's got a huge IT company, and he's based in US. He was trying to open a branch in China, and after trying for a few months, he closed down because he was not getting enough talent there. This was an Indian trying to open shop in China, and he was narrating this. So I think we have certain strengths. See, when you talk about big data, which is critical for when you talk about AI, I think the base is big data and how you handle it. I think India has got a huge comparative advantage in that. So what is the problem? I think the problem is probably policy, the kind of advantages that you have, and how you coordinate them. I think coordination is the biggest thing, and how you handle, policy making, the time that goes into policy making. There, I think we are really guilty. Because the way technology is changing, I think it changes every microsecond. Legislation, for example, you are talking about security issues, right? So legislation, one of the examples that when we are writing that report, one of the examples given by Texas Instruments, which set up shop in Bangalore. It was the first one to do way back when nobody ever thought that we'll enter the IT area. The manager was present, and he was telling us that it was, I think, 1985 or around that time, when Texas Instruments had this. At that time, you didn't have too much of internet connections, and there was some kind of a mechanism by which it will be sent to the, not satellite, some system he described. And there was a huge cone-shaped thing. And the Indian government sent somebody to monitor. So the guy will be sitting there and looking at that, whether something is happening. Everything is signals. So we didn't even know, we didn't even have the wherewithal to monitor simple things at that point of time. How much progress we have made is, even today questionable. So ultimate point is this. I think it is the rapidity of policy making and the coordination and the involvement of the various stakeholders and how you run the orchestra, the entire show. I think that is where we have much to learn. So let's remind ourselves of our positives and try to find solutions. On that note, I would like to thank you.
Thank you. quick thing about the good thing about India. I read this somewhere in the statistic that of the top companies, foreign companies that have set up their R&D centers in India and China, they have been able to come up with more patents from India than they did from China.